Chapter 11. The rest of their trip through the sewers moved swiftly after the initial confrontation. They encountered a few more of Dax's people, but no one else challenged them. If anything, they appeared relieved to know Sabine was being returned to Dax, although a few of them seemed apprehensive about her physical state. She still hadn't regained consciousness, and Malek was starting to get concerned. Malek followed Bane up a narrow stairway and into a building. He studied the hallway, recognizing the same stonework that was present in the tavern's cellar. It made sense for Dax to have multiple escape routes in the building where he conducted most of his business. Javine skidded to a halt in front of them, his eyes wide. "Tell me she's still alive." "She is, but we need to see Dax immediately," Bane said, continuing to carry Sabine over his shoulder. "Where is he?" "Probably tearing apart the tavern," Javine muttered and motioned for them to follow. "I'll let him know she's returned. He won't be pleased to see you, Bane, especially in his current mood." "Is her old room still vacant?" Bane asked, apparently unconcerned by Javine's warning. "Yes. Dax won't allow anyone else to move in there. Can you awaken Sabine? She may be the only one who can calm him down." Bane shook his head. "I'll handle Dax. But you need to hurry. I can't wake her up again without his help." Javine gave him a worried look but nodded and disappeared to another part of the tavern. Malek opened the door to the room Dax had taken her to after he'd drugged her. The shattered bottles had been cleaned up and the broken furniture replaced or repaired. It was as though nothing had ever happened. Bane placed Sabine on the bed and Malek frowned. Her face was still too pale, and even her breathing seemed to be labored. Judging by Bane's pinched expression, the demon was also concerned. He'd never thought to see a demon worried about anyone else's welfare, and it surprised him. Dax entered the room only a handful of heartbeats later with Esmelle running behind him. His eyes were silvered and he glared at Bane. Demonic magic filled the room, recognizable by the telltale sulfuric scent. You dare come here? In my presence?" Without waiting for a response, Dax charged toward Bane. The two demons locked horns and crashed into the wall, claws and blades flashing. Esmelle's eyes widened. With a muttered curse, she ran back out of the room. Malek jumped toward the bed, intent on protecting Sabine while the demons fought within the confines of the small bedroom. Moving at a speed too fast to ever be considered human, they fought with weapons, horns, teeth, and claws. They crashed into the desk, splintering it apart. "Sabine is mine," Dax roared, trying to connect his claws with the soft flesh of Bane's stomach. Bane blocked the attack and gripped Dax's horns, shoving him backward against the wall. Malek had the distinct impression Bane wasn't trying to kill his brother, but the same couldn't be said for Dax. Esmelle ran back into the room with a large pot of water. She tossed it over the two demons and shouted, "Grow." The water covering the two demons transformed into a vined plant, pinning them both against the wall. It made them pause long enough to focus on Esmelle standing defiantly in front of them. Malek stared at the red-headed witch in surprise. Such magic was far beyond a witch's normal ability. He'd only thought a fae or a dryad had the power to transmute water into plants. Esmelle lowered the pot and put her hand on her hip. "Are you two quite finished?" Dax scowled and sliced through the vines with his claws. "You dare much, little witch." "Me," Esmelle demanded and gestured to Bane. "He brought Sabine back here, and your response is to what? Kill him for it. You're both supposed to protect her, but Malek's the one standing guard over her. Now knock it off, both of you. If I'm going to try to help her, I can't waste my magic trying to tie you two up." Bane cut the vines restraining him. "She's right. We don't have time to revisit old arguments. Sabine is dying." He glanced at Sabine's unconscious form. "I don't know if your healing skills will be sufficient for this task, Esmelle." Esmelle glared at the demons and pushed past them, intent on reaching her patient. Malek moved aside to let her pass, but he wasn't willing to let the demons approach until he was sure they were back in control. Dax watched Esmelle check Sabine over, and his silvered eyes reverted to his normal amber color. Bane's eyes had changed back almost immediately after the water had hit him. Malek sheathed his weapon and stepped aside. Esmelle made a clicking noise with her tongue and headed toward the cabinet where the herbs were stored. "Dax told me what happened at the councilman's home. I don't see any physical injuries, but she's far too weak. I can barely sense her magic. I might be able to brew something that'll help strengthen her, but we need to get it down her throat. Dax sat on the edge of the bed. She wasn't this bad when I last saw her. What happened? Calling Bane said in a dry tone. I gave her what I could, but I've not taken much of her magic lately. She told Edvar how to summon me. The boy's a fool, Dax growled, reaching over to brush his fingertips against her skin. Sabine never should have taught him such magic. She was already weak after breaking the trap on the chalice, but then she tried to gift me more magic while I killed the guards. I stopped the transfer before it became too dangerous for her. Esmelle dumped some herbs into a mortar. Did you use all of it? She's still weakening for some reason. Dax scowled. It's gone except for the smallest trace. It's not enough to bring her back to stasis. Other than knowing Sabine was still alive, I couldn't sense her. If she was in that God's forsaken crypt, it explains why I couldn't locate her. Malek had been listening to the two brothers and the witch discuss the problem. None of them seemed to be paying much attention to him, which suited him fine. But something was troubling him. He studied Sabine and the paleness of her skin, trying to figure out what his mind was trying to tell him. After a long moment, he straightened. The glamour. Can any of you break glamour? Esmelle stopped crushing the herbal mixture and arched her brow. Dax and Bane turned to him, their eyes flashing to silver. Malek froze, his fingers itching to draw his weapon, but the threat of violence would only incite the demons. He didn't know Esmelle well enough to speculate. Esmelle cleared her throat and asked carefully, You've seen Sabine without her glamour. The chalice stripped it, and I was unable to shield her. Dax snapped, pushing up from the bed. He sworn a blood oath for silence. He technically didn't break it just now, but a suggestion is close enough. This keeps getting worse, Esmelle muttered with a sigh. Okay, we'll deal with that later. Why are you asking about her glamour, Malek? Forcing himself to project a calm he didn't quite feel, Malek said, if Sabine's still weakening, it's because she doesn't have enough magic. The glamour could be the reason for it. Almost in unison, Dax and Bane blinked, and their eyes returned to normal. Esmelle gave a curt nod and dropped a pinch of the contents from another vial into the mortar. Dax frowned and turned back to Sabine. You may be right about the glamour, but Sabine is the only one who can remove it. Bane studied Malek carefully, his gaze suspicious as he crossed his arms over his chest. What do you know of glamour? Not a great deal, Malek admitted truthfully. None of his people possessed such abilities, and they didn't have a way to remove it either. Glamour was one of those tricky magics that usually worked because everyone believed it to be true. Some lesser creatures could have theirs broken by disbelieving it, but the Fae were the strongest of all magical creatures when it came to that talent. To his knowledge, not even another Fae could break it. He'd hoped whatever ties Sabine shared with the demons might be enough to allow them to manipulate her magic. Bane swept his gaze over Malek again. You're not human. Malek paused before responding. No, I'm not. Dax frowned. What the hell does that have to do with anything? No one can break glamour. What are you? Bane demanded, narrowing his eyes on Malek. I'm no threat to Sabine, Malek replied evenly, unwilling to divulge his identity. He'd eventually need to tell Sabine who he was, but he didn't owe these two demons the same courtesy. Dax pushed off the bed. He's warded. Sabine's been refreshing his mark to keep it active. Bane studied the mark on Malek's wrist, and his mouth twisted in a cruel smile. Interesting. What is it you're hiding behind a ward, ship captain? You're obviously some kind of magic user. Esmelle arched her brow. You're not a witch. Part Fae, maybe? The pixies said Malek knew about them. Malek frowned, wondering what else the pixies had said. I'm not Fae. No, you're not. Sabine would have known, so you must be something she wouldn't recognize. Bane took a step toward him. The demon's hand lifted, and Malek immediately raised his to deflect a fire attack. Dragon Dax hissed, his eyes flashing to silver and staying that way. He drew his weapon and started to advance. Bane grabbed his arm and spun him around, slamming him against the wall. Dax roared out a challenge, but Bane didn't release him. Esmelle gaped at them, darting a worried glance at Sabine sleeping on the bed. Think, brother, Bane ordered, holding Dax in place. He's here for a reason. I don't care about his reasons, Dax hissed. The dragon dies. Try it, Malek snapped, prepared to yank off the ward around his neck. If he needed to kill both demons, so be it. Enough, Bane shouted, using his body to keep Dax contained. Sabine doesn't know what he is, or she never would have offered him a mark of protection. She trusts him, perhaps foolishly, but we may be able to use him to help her. Malek paused in surprise. He wasn't sure what the demon intended, but if it helped Sabine, he'd consider it. How? Dax scowled, but he'd stopped fighting Bane. No, I will not allow him near her. Balkan will be arriving in the city either tonight or tomorrow. Esmelle straightened. Balkan and Sabine are linked, right? Can't he share power with her? Bane arched his brow. The beastman is coming here. When Dax gave him a curt nod, Bane muttered a curse and released him. Balkan may be too late. During the short walk here from the crypt, Sabine weakened a great deal. She's fading. Bane held out his arm to show the mark on his wrist wasn't as vibrant. I don't know if she'll last another few hours, much less until tonight. Malek's gaze fell on Sabine, and a heavy weight pressed on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Not only had he started to care a great deal for her, but she was the best chance he had to save his people. You believe I may be able to help her? Dax scowled. She won't thank any of us if we allow a dragon near her now that we know the truth. Bane didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to regard Malek thoughtfully. Such rational behavior from a demon was suspect, but it was better than Malek being forced into killing Sabine's friends. Besides, trying to shift into his dragon form here would endanger everyone, including Sabine. Why are you here? Bane crossed his arms over his chest. You've made an effort to get close to Sabine. Why? Malek held Bane's gaze. He could refuse to answer, but it would be unlikely either brother would allow him to help Sabine, and he needed her to survive. I've spent the last several years trying to track down the artifacts used to close the portal. I heard a rumor some ancient artifacts had resurfaced in Akros, so I brought my ship here and requested an audience with Dax. Bane nodded. And you were seeking those with enough magic to power them? Yes, Malek admitted, glancing down at Sabine again. The Fae have closed their forests to all outsiders. I had hoped to find someone in the southern cities with enough magic to use the Fae artifact once I discovered it. I'd originally believed Sabine might have a close relative who was a full-blooded Fae. You're a fool, Dax said with a sneer. Dragons imprisoned and slaughtered her people for generations, and you believe she'll help you? Malek's shoulders tensed. I believe, once I have a chance to speak with her, she'll consider it. Sabine is unlike anyone I've met. I've never heard of another Fae caring for demons, human witches, and orphan children. Yet, in the short time I've known her, I've seen the depth of the ties Sabine's forged in this city. He swore a blood oath earlier tonight that he intended her no harm, Dax said, his mouth twisting in a smirk. Even if Sabine refuses his offer, she's protected from any retribution. But I'd rather just kill him. Problem neatly solved. Malek glared at Dax. Even without swearing to it, I still wouldn't harm her. You can try to kill me, but it won't end well for you. Can you breathe dragon fire while in human form? Bane asked, his words seemingly casual, but Malek didn't believe that for a minute. Malek didn't answer, unwilling to give his enemies any insight into his abilities. Esmelle's brow furrowed as she shook her head. Bane? I don't know much about dragons, but there has to be another way. Sabine won't be happy if we allow him to use magic on her, especially while she's unconscious and defenseless. Ignoring Esmelle's objections, Bane focused on Malek and gestured to Sabine. She marked you, which has created a tie of sorts between you two, even if it's temporary. If you can send your power through the mark, it should be enough to awaken her so she can drop her glamour. Taken aback by his suggestion, Malek glanced at Sabine's still figure. Dragonfire could kill her. It won't kill her if you send it through the mark, Bane said, taking a step away from Sabine and toward him. I've studied enough about your kind to know dragonfire won't harm you. If you can filter your magic by sending it into your body first through the mark, it should be enough to bring her back to some semblance of consciousness. Malek hesitated. He was protected from dragonfire and most other forms of fire, but the thought of attempting to infuse Sabine with it made him uneasy. What Bane had suggested was possible, but sharing such magic wasn't something done lightly, especially with its potential to harm the recipient. He wasn't sure it would work without a mating bond. If Sabine's mark on his wrist worked the way Bane believed, She should have sensed his magic before now. Apparently, Dax agreed because he crossed his arms over his chest and said, "No. Sabine is mine to protect. I won't allow a dragon to experiment on her." Bane snorted, "And if she dies, you swore to protect her. She won't survive until morning if we don't try something. No one else has enough of a connection with her to attempt such a thing. We're running out of options." Dax fell silent, looking down at Sabine again. After a long time, he lifted his head and met Malek's gaze. "Can you do this? Infuse her with dragon fire without harming her." Malek frowned. "Bane's reasoning is sound, but I've never attempted such a thing. In all honesty, I don't know what will happen. Dragonfire is designed to kill. It's only safe when used with our mates, but that's because they inherit a resistance to the negative effects." Bane nodded as though Malek's words had strengthened his argument. "Dax, this must be done. If he wears her mark of protection, and he's sworn a blood oath not to harm her, the dragonfire will not hurt her. The magic won't allow it." Dax scowled, not looking pleased by the prospect of allowing Malek close to her. He pointed his finger at Malek. "If this harms her in any way, you will not leave this room alive." Malek narrowed his eyes at the demon. "I would not even consider attempting such a thing if your brother hadn't suggested it. I have no intention of harming Sabine, ever." Bane made a gesture towards Sabine. "Then begin. We are wasting time arguing while she grows weaker." Malek took a step toward the sleeping woman, drawn to her on a level that was more than simple attraction. So much depended on this. He'd do everything he could to save her, but it didn't diminish his need for her assistance. He wanted her to know the truth about him, but it had to be done carefully if there was any hope of salvaging the fragile trust he'd started to build with her. "Before I do this, I ask you all to agree not to tell Sabine my secret." Esmelle's mouth formed a thin line, and the witch shook her head. Dax glared at him. "No, she will learn the truth of your deception." "I'm not disputing that," Malek agreed, glancing down at Sabine again. He wanted to believe she wouldn't regard him as an enemy, but he didn't know her well enough to guess either way. "I will tell her. I'm simply asking that you give me the opportunity to tell her the truth myself." Esmelle huffed. "Fine. I won't tell her right away. It would be better coming from you anyway. But if you don't tell her, I will." Bane studied him for a long time, and then nodded. "You have 1 day. If this works and she recovers, you will have 1 day from the time Sabine regains her full strength. If you falter or attempt to deceive her in any other way, we will tell her the truth and kill you." Dax gave him a curt nod. 1 day and no more. Malek curled his hands into fists. If it came to a battle between a dragon and 2 demons, it would be interesting to find out who would win. Based on the silver shining from Bane and Dax's eyes, they agreed and were even eager for the fight. Malek inclined his head. "Very well." Bane and Dax moved aside, allowing him to sit on the bed beside Sabine. He reached for the warding necklace around his neck and unfastened it. The power he'd been suppressing rushed through him. It had been more than a month since he'd last shackled himself, and he relished the brief moment of freedom before focusing on what needed to be done. He needed to shift into his dragon form soon to release some of his building magic. He brushed one of Sabine's braids away from her face, trailing his fingers over her soft skin. She didn't stir. Focusing on his intention to help her and his feelings for her, he lifted his wrist and blew gently against the fading mark. Nothing happened. It was as though some barrier prevented the magic from filtering back to her. Malek frowned and turned to Dax. "You said it hurts her every time she's needed to reapply the mark, and she's been taking the pain unto herself. How is that possible?" Dax shrugged. "I've never claimed to understand Fae magic." Esmelle's expression became thoughtful. "This is just speculation, but Sabine has difficulties causing pain to others. She can kill when necessary, but it has never come easily for her. She once told me it was a bit easier to take a life, knowing either Dax or Bane would steal that taint from her soul. They thrive off of consuming someone's life force or magic, but I believe Sabine's natural magic rejects harming others. She must shift it somehow so she takes the cost upon herself." Malek paused, glancing back and forth between Bane and Dax. Was it possible that was part of the reason they'd formed an agreement to protect each other? Too much didn't make sense, though. He still didn't understand why she'd left Fairy and pretended to be mostly human. Pushing aside these questions for the time being, he asked, "Her magic is tied to her blood, correct?" Dax narrowed his eyes. "As much as yours, dragon." Malek held up his hand in a request for latitude. "I have a reason for these questions. Sending the dragonfire through the mark won't be possible, but I may be able to connect with the magic in her blood." Bane's brow furrowed. "Explain." "I made a blood oath not to harm her," Malek began, watching as both demons nodded. "That oath is tied to my blood and magic. It was accepted and the wound was healed by Sabine in acknowledgement of my vow. Going by that logic, I should be able to create a similar wound and use my blood to provide her with some resistance to the dragonfire." Clever Bane murmured thoughtfully. "As ideas go, it has merit." Dax frowned. "And the effects of dragon blood on a Fae?" Malek winced and shook his head. In dragon form, his molten blood could be a weapon, burning his enemies alive. In his current form, it shouldn't be dangerous, but he'd never shared blood and magic with a Fae. Intent was a large part of magic, and the last thing he wanted was to harm her. It hasn't ended well for the Fae in the past, but to the best of my knowledge, no one had a mark that connected them. I won't say it's completely without risk, but I believe it's our best option. Bane glanced over at Dax. "Can you get a message to the beastman to see if he can get here sooner?" No, Dax grumbled and rubbed his chin in thought. "Balkan's message came by bird, so it's likely he's already on the move. A seer in his village had a vision of the wild hunt rising again. She foresaw an iron dagger being used in an attack against a woman of Fae heritage. Balkan's coming here because he believes Sabine's in danger." Malek cocked his head, wondering again about this Balkan. He'd never had the opportunity to meet one of the beast people. They primarily lived within the confines of the silver forest surrounding Fairy. From what little he knew about them, they were sworn to serve the Fae. During the Great War, the Fae formed armies of beast people by twisting the magic of the gods and making some of the animals in their forests more human-like. Some resembled lions, wolves, foxes, bears, and even birds of prey had been used. They were the ruthless defenders of Fairy, and some of the beast people were dedicated not only to protect Fairy but also to serve certain families. If this Balkan considered himself Sabine's protector, it was surprising he hadn't remained by her side. What was even more curious and troubling was two full-blooded demons appeared to defer to the beastman. "We don't have a choice then," Bane muttered with a curse. Focusing again on Malek, he asked, "What do you need to attempt this blood connection?" "A small cut on her hand and mine will allow my blood to enter her wound and offer her some measure of protection." Malek turned back to Sabine and took her hand in his. Running his fingers over her palm, he said, "From there I can breathe the dragonfire directly into her." The dragon within him roared in anticipation. Malek wanted to do this, he realized with a trace of surprise. The thought of sharing blood and magic, as well as forging a deeper connection with Sabine, was more than alluring, it was intoxicating. "Then do it," Dax said, gesturing for him to get on with it. Malek withdrew his knife and cut his hand first before turning the knife on Sabine. He hesitated and then shook his head. "One of you needs to make the cut. My oath prevents me from any harm, even if the end result will help her." Dax nodded and took the knife, cutting a small line on Sabine's palm. She murmured something unintelligible in her sleep, but didn't awaken. Blood welled to the surface of her hand. Malek clasped his hand over hers, allowing their blood to intermingle. Her magic, potent and beguiling, surged through him, and he closed his eyes, breathing in her power. She was exquisite. Her raw energy was more enticing than anything he could have imagined. He opened his eyes to look down at her, willing her to awaken. Intention was an important part of this magic, and he needed to focus on protecting and reviving Sabine. Still grasping her hand, he pressed his lips against hers and exhaled the dragonfire into her body. Sabine's mouth parted on a gasp, and she murmured his name. In the throes of her healing slumber, Sabine didn't resist him or the magic he offered. He cupped the back of her head with his free hand, continuing to infuse her with his power. The smell of night-blooming flowers he'd begun to associate with Sabine filled the air and co-mingled with the sharper scent of smoke and burnt leaves from the dragonfire. Reluctantly, he eased away, but the sense of awareness and connection remained. Sabine blinked open her eyes, her brows furrowing in confusion as she whispered, "Malek." "Little one," Bane interrupted before he could respond and crouched beside the bed. You need to remove your glamour and recharge your magic. Dax and I will watch over you until you're recovered. Her eyes widened, and she started to sit up. Where's Dax? Is he all right? Bane gently eased her back down and brushed one of her braids away from her face. He's well. We all are, but you need to rest and recover. We don't have any more magic to give you. Dax took a step toward the bed. I'm fine, Sabine. Remove the glamour so it'll stop draining you. When you're better, we're going to talk about that stupid move you pulled in the councilman's home. Sabine gave him a small smile, settled back, and closed her eyes with a sigh. A moment later, the glamour fell away and she was once again asleep. Malek didn't move and couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She was beautiful and far more exotic in appearance than he'd first thought. Her hair was nearly white with strands of silver reminiscent of moonlight. Her skin was still fair, glowing softly with the remnants of her power. Intricate marks of silvered vines wound up her hands and wrists, continuing upward where they disappeared under her clothing. He'd heard the tattoos were markings of power, given to Fae children at a very young age as their magical abilities took hold. They were supposed to be painful, blending both blood and magic together, and then pierced under the skin. She'd obviously spent a great number of years living among the Fae. Bane nodded. Good, her coloring is better. Let me check her hand. Malek hesitated, wanting to continue touching her but knowing he needed to pull away. Reluctantly, he released her, and Bane took her injured hand. The air around her hand shimmered with a strange energy, and the wound began to fuse back together. Malek arched his brow in surprise. Interesting. I wasn't aware demons could heal. Only Sabine, Bane said, pushing off the floor. Esme, she'll need some of your tea when she awakens next. Esmelle nodded. I'll finish preparing it. I can sit with her until she wakes up again. Malek stood, barely listening to the conversation as he gazed down at Sabine. He was tempted to remain with her until she recovered, but he suspected her demon protectors, and which friend would have a problem with that? As though sensing Malek's internal conflict, Dax took a step toward him. Be careful, Dax warned, his eyes flaring silver briefly. Right now, the fact you helped stabilize her is the only reason you're still alive. Malek held Dax's gaze, refusing to look away now that Dax knew the truth. I'd like to inspect the chalice we acquired earlier this evening. Not until Sabine awakens, Dax retorted, crossing his arms over his chest. Until the magic has been completely disabled, it won't be leaving my vault. You may remain here in the tavern until then. If you try to leave, I'll have your crew executed and your ship sunk. Malek cocked his head. You believe I intend to betray Sabine? Dax gave him a cruel smile. I take Sabine's protection very seriously. Until we've determined you're not a threat to her or planning to divulge her secrets, I'll be keeping a close eye on you. So be it, Malek said, fastening the warding necklace around his neck and trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation of his magic being suppressed. He hadn't intended to leave now that he'd found Sabine, and Dax had just made his life much easier. Without another word, he turned and left the room. Chapter 12. Sabine opened her eyes to stare at a familiar ceiling. She had no recollection of how she'd ended up back in her old room at the tavern. A scraping noise caught her attention, and she turned her head. Esmelle glanced up from where she was weaving herbs on a new drying rack. Oh good, you're finally awake. We were starting to get worried. Sabine frowned and sat up, rubbing her eyes. How long was I out? Almost a full day, Esmelle said cheerfully, putting the small portable rack to the side. You got up once or twice, but you were pretty out of it. I'm not surprised you don't remember. Bane and Dax have been nuisances, refusing to let anyone near you. Except you, Sabine guessed, wondering what sort of problems had emerged with both demons together in the same space. It was probably too much to hope they'd resolve their issues, but at least they hadn't killed each other yet. She should probably be grateful for such small favors. Esmelle grinned and picked up a pot of tea from the table. She poured a cup and said, I told them they'd have to deal with you if they tried to keep me away. I swear, they're the two scariest people in this city, and they're terrified of you. Sabine yawned and stretched. If they knew what was good for them, they'd be more scared of you. One little waggle of your fingers and you'd turn them into toads or hang them from a tree by their horns. Esme laughed and handed her the cup. Sabine sniffed at it, but it was a simple combination of complementary herbs. She took a sip. This is pretty good. Blossom gathered more mint for you. Esmelle nodded. She did. I think she's worried about you. Sabine lifted her head to meet Esmelle's gaze. How so? Esmelle put her hand on her hip, tilting her head and causing a red curl to fall across her forehead. She brushed it aside absently. Something about the moon disappearing? A magical explosion that brought another family of pixies to my garden? She had a fit and said she was going to track you down if you didn't show up soon. Sabine squeezed her eyes shut and groaned. Blossom was probably beside herself at being unable to communicate with her. If Blossom knew the other pixie clan, it was unlikely their arrival heralded good news. The other option was even worse. If her magical workings had drawn the attention of an unrelated clan, that meant the ripple effects of her power had scattered far beyond the boundaries of Akros. The pixies flocked to any powerful source of magic, and she'd essentially hung out a welcome mat announcing her presence to anyone in the vicinity. On another note, Esmelle said, that ship captain came in to check on you a few times. I thought Dax or Bane were going to kill him, but they seemed to have reached an uneasy truce of sorts. I talked to him a little bit while we were waiting for you to wake up. I wasn't sure about him at first, right? But I can see why you're interested in him. Sabine frowned and looked down at her arms, but her glamour was back in place. She had a vague recollection of Malek kissing her, and Dax and Bane telling her to release the glamour. She must have reapplied it one of the times she'd woken up, but she knew Malek had been there when she'd lowered it. She just didn't remember his reaction. Taking another sip of her tea, she said, Malek saw through my glamour. Did he say anything? Esmelle shook her head. No, but he didn't have to say a word. Sabine, a man doesn't face down 2 angry demons and a witch so he can check on a woman 5 times in less than a day, unless he really likes her. From the sparks you two were putting off the other day in the garden, I'd say it goes both ways. To hell with your glamour. I'd say he likes you in any form he can get you. I just want you to be careful. You don't know him very well yet. Sabine hid her smile behind the rim of her cup. She had every intention of getting to know him much better. Esmelle laughed. Good. Now that we've got that settled, Dax arranged to have some clothing and personal items brought to you. They're in the chest. I'll let you get cleaned up and dressed. Henry's wife made a huge pot of vegetable stew for you. And it's simmering in the kitchen. Bane threatened to hurt anyone who got near it before you woke up. Martha cooked for me. Sabine sat up straighter at the prospect. Martha was a fantastic cook, and her food was one of the things Sabine missed most about staying here. Esme grinned, her green eyes twinkling with humor. Yes, but Martha snuck me a bowl when Bane's back was turned. It's absolutely delicious. Not even Bane's threats are going to keep people away for long if you don't get out there. It's been driving everyone crazy all day. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. I'm glad you're okay, Sabine. You had all of us worried. Sabine tilted her head and smiled. I think I worried myself a bit this time too. Esmelle nodded and returned her smile. I'll let you get dressed. Come out whenever you're ready. I need to run back to the shop and check on things, but I'll be back soon. Bane and Dax are running around somewhere. I'll let them know you're awake before I go. After the door closed behind Esme, Sabine stood and rubbed the kinks out of her neck from sleeping so long. She put the empty cup on the table and caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Dax must have undressed her while she slept, only leaving her in an overly large shirt and nothing else. She opened the chest, but there was only another one of his shirts folded inside along with undergarments. Her weapons were missing too. She could run naked through the streets relying solely on her glamour, but her magic hadn't yet recovered enough for such an undertaking. Dax clearly intended to make escaping difficult. Muttering a colorful curse, she ran her hand through her hair to find he'd also unbraided it and taken her hairpins too. I'm going to kill him, Sabine muttered, snatching up the shirt and heading into the small room next to the bedroom. Lifting the pump handle, she poured some water into the basin and washed herself quickly. By the time she finished taking care of her immediate needs, her stomach grumbled a complaint. Pulling Dax's shirt over her head, she scowled at the realization it only fell to mid-thigh. She wouldn't be walking around the main floor of the tavern or leaving until she acquired more clothing, which was why Dax had stolen hers. She huffed and left the bedroom, heading in the direction of the kitchen and the source of the delicious smells permeating the air. The kitchen was empty when she entered, but she could hear what sounded like a card game being played in the next room. Ignoring it, she walked over to the large wood-burning stove and the pot simmering on top of it. She grabbed a cloth and lifted the lid, her stomach making another appreciative rumble as the heavenly aroma escaped. Sabine scooped out a large bowl of the soup and replaced the lid before heading over to the table. She took a bite and let out a moan of appreciation. Martha had gone above and beyond, even including some of her favorite vegetables and spices. It was a complex blend of flavors, all perfectly complementing each other, and proving some humans had their own brand of magic. A cheer went up from the next room, but she ignored it and ate several more bites before putting the bowl to the side. Walking over to the cupboards, she started searching for one of the bottles of wine Henry had hidden for her. Such a meal deserved nothing less. "You're awake," Malek said behind her. She spun around, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. His eyes warmed as he perused her up and down, lingering overly long on her bare legs before meeting her eyes. Her face heated at his frank appraisal, but she couldn't bring herself to look away as he took a step toward her. "How are you feeling, Sabine?" "Better," she said quietly, wishing she had her weapons on her. Even though she didn't intend any harm to Malek, she felt surprisingly vulnerable without them. Although part of that could be because he knew some of what she was hiding. Other than Esmelle, Dax and Bane, no one outside of Fairy had seen her without glamour. Malek crossed the room toward her, stopping only when he was within touching distance. He searched her expression, and the conflicted emotions on his face were surprising. Sabine frowned, wondering if Esmelle had misread the situation and his interest in her. "What do you remember?" She tilted her head to study him, getting the impression he was worried about her answer. "Not much, only bits and pieces. I remember escaping from the councilman's home, heading toward the crypt, but not much else. Little flashes. Esme said I woke up a few times, and you came to check on me." He frowned. "That's all." "I remember you kissing me," she admitted with a small smile. "At least I'm somewhat memorable," he murmured, a trace of a grin on his lips. Reaching up, he tucked some of her hair behind her ear and trailed his fingers down the side of her face. She closed her eyes, leaning into his hand and relishing his touch. Something about this man intrigued her. Perhaps it was the power she sensed below the surface, but she didn't think that was quite right. He called to her on a fundamental level, more so than anyone she'd ever met. Taking a step toward him, she closed the distance between them and placed her hand against his chest. "You're a little more than just memorable." Malek cupped her face and lowered his head, pressing his lips against hers. It was just a gentle pressure as though she were impossibly fragile, but the heat lurking beneath the surface of his kiss was undeniable. He pulled back far too soon for her liking but didn't move away. Instead, he trailed his thumb across her cheek and murmured, "In my wildest dreams, I never expected to meet someone like you. You could easily cause me to forget everything, Sabine, including my entire purpose for coming here." Her heart soared at his words. In her mind, he could easily do the same to her. She gave him a small smile. Sometimes fate takes us in unexpected directions, but we always end up where we're supposed to be. "I'd like to believe that," Malek murmured, lifting some of her hair and rubbing it between his fingers. The shadows in Malek's eyes were troubling, but she wouldn't pry. They both had a past, and sometimes reliving it could be painful. Perhaps she could connect with him another way. "There's a bottle of wine in the cabinet behind me. Will you share a glass with me?" He reached over to take the bottle off the top shelf. "This is fairy wine, right? The same kind Dax drugged." Sabine smiled and nodded. "Yes, but this one is safe. Dax won't try anything like that again." For a while, selecting a clean goblet from the cabinet, she walked over to the table and placed it beside her bowl. "Martha made a wonderful stew. If you'd like some, it's on the stove." "That's all right," he said, sitting beside her and opening the wine. He poured some into the cup and recapped the bottle. Sabine lifted the goblet and swirled the contents. "Have you ever shared wine before?" Malek arched his brow. "Your tone makes me think there's some sort of ritual that goes beyond simply sharing a drink." Very perceptive, and yes, Sabine agreed with a laugh and put the goblet down between them. "It's not exactly a ritual, but more of a way to share a memory or an experience." "I'm intrigued," he admitted. "How does this work?" She lifted her gaze to meet his and tried to ignore the familiar fluttering in her stomach that seemed to occur whenever he looked at her. If you were Fae, we could simply drink from the same cup to share a memory. Since you're not, I'd like to share some of my power with you so you can get the full experience. Malek frowned. Sabine, you've spent the last day and most of this evening in a restorative sleep. I'm not sure you should attempt anything else until you're fully recovered. Touched by the concern in his eyes, she smiled at him. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way without any expectations in return. Reaching over, she placed her hand over his. This isn't major magic, it's simply a sharing of power with very little cost. The magic itself is in the wine. I can unlock it so you can experience it too. How? Will you allow me the use of your knife? Malek unsheathed his weapon and passed it over to her hilt first. She took it from him, admiring the expensive weapon. It was excellent dwarven workmanship, both serviceable and decorative. She pricked her finger with the tip of the blade and squeezed it until 2 drops of blood fell into the wine. Malek's eyes widened. She gave him a small smile. Will you allow me to give you a gift of my blood? He glanced at her finger and nodded. She squeezed her finger again until her blood welled to the surface. Holding out her finger, she offered it to him. Malek held her gaze as he wrapped his hand around her wrist. He lifted her hand and wrapped his lips around her finger. Her mouth parted on a gasp. Malek's mouth was warm, almost hot, as his tongue encircled her finger, catching the blood and the power she offered. The gesture was erotic and sensual, and her heart pounded at the rush of desire that flooded through her. He pressed a kiss against her fingertip. You honor me with such a gift. You saved my life, Malek. I owe you much more than this. No, he said quickly, squeezing her hand. There is no debt between us. I will explain why soon, but for now please do not feel you owe me anything. She studied him for a long time, gauging his sincerity. Unlike the Fae, humans and some other magical races could lie. She had the impression Malek was being honest, but he was also hiding something. It wasn't in her nature to pry, especially when staying silent about her own secrets had saved her life over the years. Everyone was entitled to keep their own counsel. Picking up the goblet again, she swirled the wine to mix it with her blood. Sabine lifted it to her lips, drinking deeply and tasting the memory of the forest. The rich scent of the trees, including the revered silver oaks, tickled her nose. The memory of her home filled her with a combination of peace and longing. She offered Malek the goblet, and he took it, taking a sip of the wine. His eyes widened and then closed, and he took a deep breath. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with awe. The silver forest. It's the forest that protects the home of the Fae. Yes, she said quietly, pleased he could see it. His eyes opened, and he gazed at her with wonder. I had no idea this was possible. Every time you drink fairy wine, this is what you experience. Sabine laughed and shook her head. No, each vintner has their own specialty, and each bottle is identified by the memory it may evoke. A bottle with a green mark on the top, such as this one, usually contains the memories and magic of nature or the forest. Malek chuckled. I had no idea. Now I'll need to check the rest of the cases on my ship. What do the other colors mean? It depends on who crafted it and the magic of the person drinking it, she admitted, reaching for the goblet again. Usually, a purple label will draw upon the creativity of the drinker. You may hear music or revisit a book you loved. Blue is more soothing, perhaps holding a memory of a peaceful place you once visited. Red is the color for passion, and that wine is usually shared between lovers. I wonder if I have any of the red bottles. Sabine laughed and took a sip, once again allowing the memory of the forest to fill her with a peaceful calm. She offered it to him. This time, close your eyes and take a drink. I want to show you one of my favorite places in the forest. He did as she asked, and she placed her hand over his and closed her eyes, reaching for the connection between them. When she opened her eyes again, the tavern's kitchen had faded away, and they were standing in a small clearing in the middle of the forest. Birds chittered in the trees, their songs an accompaniment to the soothing sound of the rushing river. Malek stared at the trees overhead in amazement. She approached him quietly. I wasn't sure you'd be able to see it this vividly. At the sound of her voice, Malek turned toward her and froze. His heated gaze roamed over her, and he swallowed. Sabine looked down at herself and the Fae markings that traveled up her arms. She wore a simple dress in the style of her people. which showcased the pattern marks she'd attained during her younger years. She gave him a shy smile. Here you see me as I really am without any glamour, or at least how I see myself in my mind's eye. Illusions don't always work for the Fae when we're lost in memory. Malek closed the distance between them. He reached up to tuck her loose hair behind her ear and trailed his fingers down in a gentle caress, their path sending a surge of heat through her. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, Sabine. He paused and his brow furrowed. Is this dangerous for you? Can anyone else see you? Sabine shook her head, touched by his concern. No, we'll hear if anyone comes into the kitchen, but they won't see anything other than two people sitting at the table with their eyes closed. Malek reached down to take her hand in his. How much of this magic is real? As real as any magic or memory, she said with a shrug and looked at the canopy of trees overhead. The sunlight filtered down, causing the shadows to dance through the leaves. It was beautiful, but it saddened her to know she may never see it again. Will you tell me about this place? She nodded, continuing to hold his hand as she led him toward the river. I spent a lot of time here as a child. Whenever my brother and I wanted to avoid our lessons, we used to sneak away and come here. We spent far too much time reenacting the last war, but we always won in a sweeping victory. You mentioned your brother before. Is he still with the Fae? Sabine frowned. Even in this place of memory, mentioning certain names could draw unwanted attention and allow some creatures to listen in. Dreamwalkers and memory walkers were rare, but not unheard of, especially among the Fae and some of their allies. It's better not to say too much. He squeezed her hand. I never thought to see the inside of the forest. Your people don't allow outsiders to come here. It's not forbidden, but it's not done lightly either, she admitted, watching the sunlight dance over the water. The forests are sentient, and once permission is given, it's difficult to revoke it. It's only one of our defenses, but it's very effective. Malek looked upward again at the trees. This entire place is incredible. I can see why you'd want to visit it like this. Sabine smiled, glancing up and trying to see it through his eyes. She hadn't traveled much, but the protective trees didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Others had tried to steal saplings and transplant them in other areas without success. They fed off sunlight and Fae magic, which was why they were so rare. The leaves were a deep green like any normal oak tree, but the veins of each leaf were streaked with silver, like the marks of power etched on her skin. Malek reached out and touched the bark of one of the trees. It's so real. The smell, the feel of it, everything. This place is extraordinary. How long does the magic last? Only until the wine is gone, she said, secretly pleased by his reaction. Some of our elders enjoy their wine a little too much, getting lost in their memories of the past instead of embracing the present. But it's a way to share experiences with each other, and a way to learn from our past through reflection. He glanced over at her. If you bring someone into your memory with you, does whatever happens here also extend into the real world? Sabine hesitated. They were a little too close to discussing knowledge forbidden to outsiders. She might have fled her home to save her life, but she wasn't willing to betray her people. What do you mean? If I kiss you here, he began, taking another step closer to her, will I be kissing you in the real world too? Her mouth curved into a smile, and she shook her head. Not usually. It can be done, but the intention needs to be there. Sometimes the duality of physical intimacy both here and in the real world can be rather intense, pleasurable but intense. In that case, I'm definitely going to have to see if we have a bottle of that red wine on my ship, he murmured, cupping her face and kissing her gently. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she softened her body against his as he deepened the kiss. The magnetism between them ignited, and she ran her hands up his chest, feeling the heat from his body and the strong play of muscles under his clothing. Here, in the relative safety of this memory, she didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. Malek might not know all her secrets, but he knew more than most people. For that reason alone, this kiss meant far more to her than it probably should. The sound of footsteps interrupted them, and Sabine pulled away, sliding them from the memory and back into the tavern's kitchen. She blinked, staring over at Bane on the other side of the room. His hands were curled into fists as he glared at Malek with silvered eyes. Malek muttered a curse and leaned back, returning Bane's scowl. Sabine frowned at Bane and stood, not particularly pleased with the angry demon vibes he was throwing off. He turned his gaze on her and blinked, the silver fading almost immediately. She relaxed as he crossed the room toward her. I was just coming to check on you. Esmelle said you were awake. He scanned her up and down. How are you feeling? She smiled at him and stood on her toes to kiss his cheek. Better, although I'd be happier if Dax hadn't stolen my weapons and clothing. He chuckled. My brother has always been talented at riling you up, but in this instance, I was the one who suggested we take your belongings. Balkan's going to be here soon. We need you to stay here until then. Sabine blew out a breath, having forgotten all about the beastman's visit. Given the circumstances, Bane's decision made sense. Bane studied the table, the wine bottle, and the goblet that had been between them. You're sharing wine? With him? Sabine frowned at his sharp tone. Bane wasn't usually as possessive as Dax, so this was somewhat surprising. Yes, is that a problem? Bane was quiet for a moment as though trying to reach a decision. Finally, he sighed. Dax needs you. He just came up from the cellar, and he's been in one of his moods since you were injured. Javen asked me to see if you'd be willing to help run interference. She glanced toward the closed door. The voices were more muted, but no one was screaming. Has he killed anyone yet? No one important, Bane said with a shrug. He'll come tearing in here once he finds out you're awake. I suggest you go to him before then. I'll clean up the wine. Sabine nodded and turned back to Malek and smiled. We'll talk more later. Malek returned her smile, but there was a slight tension around his eyes. I look forward to it. She started to head toward the door but stopped and put her hand on Bane's arm. The way Bane and Malek were regarding each other made her uneasy, as though something was going on between them. In a quiet voice she asked, Does Dax really need me? Or are you trying to get me to leave? I won't kill the ship captain, he said with a trace of a sneer, still glaring at Malek. At least not right now. When she frowned at him, Bane waved her off. We will be out in a moment, and I won't touch a hair on his head while you're gone. But Dax will likely kill someone if you don't reassure him you're alive and well. Sabine grinned and kissed his cheek again. Turning away, she squared her shoulders and headed toward the door, mentally preparing to tame the other demon in her life. Chapter 13. Malek kept an eye on Bane as Sabine headed out of the room. The experience of sharing wine with her had been beyond anything he'd expected, and he was still a little disconcerted. As soon as the door closed behind Sabine, Malek got to his feet. You didn't tell her, Bane said with a low growl in his voice. He stormed over to the table and snatched up the goblet of wine. Putting it to his lips, he downed the rest of it. A moment later, shock colored his expression and his gaze flew to Malek. Of all places, she took you there. Malek frowned, irritated. Bane had been able to intrude on a private moment between them. He didn't know enough about how such magic worked, or he would have stopped Bane before he touched the goblet. When Malek didn't say anything, Bane shook his head and stared at the empty cup. Sabine doesn't share such things lightly, but for some foolish reason she trusts a dragon. She offered you a piece of herself and you took it, yet you continue to deceive her. A cold hand gripped Malek's heart. Bane was right, but Malek couldn't regret sharing the experience with her. It's not my intention to hurt her. You will. Bane walked over to a sack in the corner. He grabbed a handful of salt and dumped it in the goblet to break the magic completely. Leaving the salted cup on the counter, he picked up the bottle of wine and put it away. When he was finished, Bane pressed his hands against the counter and lowered his chin to his chest. His voice was quiet when he spoke, and it lacked his earlier anger. Tell her soon, ship captain. Before she falls in love with you, if it isn't too late already. Malek didn't respond. There wasn't anything he could say, especially when Bane was right. When Sabine found out who he was, she might not forgive him. He hadn't intended to mislead her, and the longer he waited, the worse it would be when she learned the truth. Leaving Bane to his thoughts, Malek headed out of the room in the same direction Sabine had gone. The game of chance Dax's crew had been playing was more muted, with each of the players darting surreptitious glances at Dax and Sabine standing in the corner of the room. They were speaking too low for him to hear what they were saying, but their body language made it apparent Sabine had calmed the worst of Dax's anger. Her hands were pressed against Dax's chest, and she was giving him a teasing smile. In return, Dax gazed down at her with an expression that spoke of a long shared history and intimacy. The sight, especially after what Malek had shared with her in the kitchen, elicited a sharp pang of jealousy. The dragon within him wanted to yank her out of Dax's grasp. The warding medallion heated around his neck, warning him to get control of his emotions. Unmindful of Malek's presence or his internal conflict, the demon lifted his clawed hand and trailed the back of it across Sabine's cheek. Such a move could be considered a threat if it weren't for Dax's teasing expression and Sabine's laughter. She wrapped her hand around the demon's wrist, leaning into him and saying something that made the demon chuckle. The sight was a sharp cry from Dax's response after Malek had revived Sabine. The demon had been furious and out of control, lashing out at everyone and anyone who happened to be nearby. Javen had suggested Dax might want to take out his aggression on Riven, the man who had betrayed Sabine by selling her location. The resulting screams had lasted for hours and could be heard throughout the tavern and even into the streets. The distraction had offered a brief reprieve for Dax's other men though, and Malek had tried to keep some distance between himself and Dax since then. "You joining us for the next game?" Javen gestured to the empty seat Malek had occupied earlier. "Very well," he agreed, sitting down while Javen dealt him in. They were playing a variation of skulls and crossbones he'd never seen before, as evidenced by how quickly he lost the last round. That's how he'd ended up running into Sabine in the kitchen. "You can deal me in two," Dax said from the corner. Wrapping his arm around Sabine's waist, he led her toward the table. The young man sitting next to Malek jumped up. "You can take my seat, Dax. I'll sit out this round." Dax didn't respond but slid into the seat, pulling Sabine down with him and onto his lap. He didn't spare Malek a glance, and instead, put his hand on Sabine's bare leg. She rested her head against Dax's shoulder while Javen collected the thin, flat wooden discs and shuffled them. Each wooden disc was painstakingly illustrated with images of different races. It was essentially a makeshift battle where each player decided what moves and countermoves they should make, depending on the makeup of the discs in their hand. At the end of the round, the person with the most well-balanced group usually won. A bit of luck didn't hurt either. Bane emerged from the kitchen area carrying a bowl of stew and put it on the table in front of Dax. "She needs to eat something." Sabine frowned. "I had a few bites." Not enough. Bane's tone brooked no argument, and he turned away and walked back into the kitchen. "Eat," Sabine, Dax ordered, nodding toward the bowl. Sabine shrugged and pulled the bowl closer to her. Everyone else at the table gave the bowl covetous looks. She arched her brow. "Martha made a huge pot in there. I can't eat all of it." Javen chuckled as two of their players jumped up and ran to the kitchen. He started dealing out the cards. Same rules as before. The last player standing wins, unless you get the crossbones. Then you have an automatic death throw at the person of your choice. While Sabine ate, Dax nuzzled her neck and murmured, "I want you staying here until Balkan leaves the city. He should be here no later than morning, unless something comes up." Sabine made a small noise of agreement. "All right, I'd like him to look at the chalice too. I'm not sure how the Lich Ward was embedded over it, and he might have an idea. What did you do with it?" "It's in the vault," Dax said, reaching for the wooden discs Javen passed to him. "If you stay longer, I could be persuaded to give you another silver dagger." Sabine paused. "Dwarven." "If you'd like," Dax agreed, studying the wooden discs in his hand. "What did you think of the other one I sent over to you?" "It's very pretty," she said, going back to her stew. "You knew I wouldn't be able to resist it." Dax chuckled and tossed a few coins on the table to place his bet. Malek studied his wooden discs, debating how much to wager. Sabine glanced at him. "You know how to play." "It's a bit different from the versions I've played before, but I'll catch on." "Show me what you have," Sabine said, leaning toward him. He held out his hand enough so she could see them, and she pointed to two of them, a troll and a goblin. Picking up a few of the coins they used for betting, she tossed them onto the table and winked at him. Dax didn't appear pleased with her offer to help him, but the demon could get over it. Malek wasn't in a mood to consider Dax's wishes when Sabine was curled up on his lap. "You're not eating," Dax reminded her. He selected one of the playing discs in his hand and tossed it onto the table. Sabine huffed, but she resumed eating. Javen slid Dax a replacement disc and looked at Malek expectantly. Malek studied his hand, curious about the two discs she'd pointed out to him. If he'd been playing the way he usually did, he'd have selected to discard different ones, probably the human and the dwarf. Trusting Sabine, he picked up the two she indicated, and she gave him a brilliant smile, her eyes twinkling with humor. Passing them over to Sabine, he decided it would be worth it for that look in her eyes even if he lost. Sabine handed him two more illustrated discs. He got a witch and another troll, but this troll had a higher number of bones on the card, indicating its power level. Sabine pushed aside her nearly empty bowl and leaned toward him again to see his pieces. Her eyes lit up, and she gave him a nod of approval. Dax scowled and put his hand on her leg again. If you want to play, we can deal you in. I'm probably going back to bed after this, Sabine said with a yawn and stretched. Her shirt slid upward, exposing more of her bare legs. Malek's gaze lowered to them, wondering if the glamour also hid markings on other parts of her body. He swallowed, trying to pay attention to what was happening as each player went around the table playing their game pieces. She leaned against Dax's shoulder again, positioning herself so she could watch the game unfold and see Malek's playing pieces. On Malek's turn, Javian tossed down a witch marker. He started to pull out his higher-level troll, identified by the number of bones on the card, but Sabine shook her head and pointed to the witch in his hand. He arched his brow but went ahead and played it, curious about her reasoning. Javian paused, darting a look at Sabine, who smiled sweetly at him. He chuckled and passed both discs to Malek, indicating he'd won that round. If Sabine's helping you, maybe we should just hand you the winnings now. I have no idea why that hand won, Malek admitted. Sabine laughed and flipped over the wooden pieces they'd just played. She pointed to an area he hadn't noticed. See the etchings on here that indicate a wind is blowing? Javian played an air witch. Yours had flames around the edges, which indicates a fire witch. Even though your game piece was lower level, wind will only enhance the fire witch's ability by causing the fire to spread. Your witch won by default. Malek leaned back in surprise, taking the opportunity to study the details on each wooden piece, including the one still in his hand. Sabine was right. Their version of the game was more multifaceted than he had expected. In addition to the bones on the card indicating their level of power, each race also had other subtle variations on it denoting the type of magical ability or strength of that game piece. This deck is extraordinary. It adds more nuances to a relatively simplistic game, Malek said, the realization only elevating his opinion of Dax's crew. They might operate on the shadowed side of the law, but they had proven themselves to be extraordinarily clever. With much more confidence now, Malek played the troll marker. Sabine settled back against Dax again, and the demon tossed out another game piece. Javian passed both of them to Dax. The game proceeded for another few rounds until Bane emerged from the kitchen. He looked down at Sabine, whose eyes had closed at some point. Good, she's sleeping again. I'll take her. Dax nodded and leaned back to allow Bane to pick her up. Put her in my room. Not a chance, Bane retorted and headed back out of the room with Sabine in his arms. Dax chuckled as though unsurprised by his brother's reply and organized his remaining game pieces. Javian glanced over at the closed kitchen door where Bane had disappeared. Did you tell her we found Terrence? No, not until she recovers completely. Malek straightened. He hadn't realized they'd located him. Did Terrence say anything about the attack? Javian frowned and tossed another game piece on the table. Nothing to say. One of our people found him floating in the harbor with his throat cut. Looked like it may have been done by someone from the Assassin's Guild. It wasn't. Dax took the wooden discs Javian passed to him. They would have weighed down the body better, not left it for us to find. Someone wanted us to believe it was one of Bane's people. Javian's brows furrowed, and he muttered a curse under his breath. They're trying to pit us against Bane's crew. Appears that way, Dax said with a shrug. Malek frowned, selected one of his remaining game pieces, and pushed it toward the center of the table. His mind wasn't really on playing anymore. Instead, he was considering the ledger Sabine had discovered in Terrence's home. He'd started trying to decipher it, but there were a lot of things that didn't make sense. He'd planned on sharing his thoughts with Sabine first. Given the news of Terrence's death and Sabine's weakened state, he needed to reveal the information to Dax now. Sabine and I went back to Terrence's home the other night. She discovered a ledger under one of the floorboards. It was written in some kind of code. Dax's eyes narrowed. You did what? Javian winced and slid a little lower in his seat. Malek held Dax's gaze. She wanted to search his home. I accompanied her so she wouldn't go alone, especially since someone is seeking to harm her. It's a good thing she went, since she managed to discover a ledger everyone else missed. At her request, I've been working on unlocking the code. We originally assumed it was a list of debts and winnings from his gambling hall, but I no longer believe that's the case. Show me this ledger. Dax pushed away from the table. Malek handed Javian his game pieces and stood. Dax followed him back out to the main tavern room, which was in full swing and would be for several more hours. A few people he'd begun to recognize nodded at Malek in greeting, but at the sight of Dax they didn't call out or interrupt. Although, Dax's thunderous expression might have had something to do with that. Malek climbed the stairs and pushed open the door to his empty room. He'd sent Levin back to the ship after he'd infused Sabine with his dragonfire. Malek hadn't shared his reasons for asking Levin to leave the tavern. His oath prevented him from telling Levin what happened, but Malek didn't want to put his first mate and closest friend at risk. Levin was a wyvern, one of the lesser dragons. In a battle between a demon and wyvern, Dax would likely be the winner. Levin was crafty and quick, but he wouldn't be a match for such a formidable opponent. Besides, if Malek failed or fell for any reason, someone needed to send word back to the Sky Cities that his efforts hadn't been successful. Walking over to the desk, he unlocked the box containing some of his maps and pulled out the ledger he'd hidden underneath them. He handed it to Dax, who flipped it open and glanced through the pages with a frown. You've deciphered some of this. Not exactly. Malek began and pointed to the various columns. I originally thought these were dates, client names, and then corresponding amounts. I tried to figure out the symbols I assumed represented the coin amounts, but they weren't adding up. How so? Malek pointed to the last column. There's no method for tracking the overall wins or losses. Too many of the center columns were duplicates, which is why I originally thought they were names. I still think they're names, but the last column are locations, not amounts. Dax studied the ledger for a long time. He placed it on the desk and grabbed a blank parchment. Malek handed him a piece of charcoal and the demon started sketching some symbols. It was similar to what Malek had been doing, looking for crossover between them. 3 sets of symbols were repeated regularly. If he wasn't already dead, I'd kill him again, Dax said with a scowl and tossed the charcoal down. Terrence was tracking Sabine, Bane, and me. Malek frowned and studied the parchment. How do you figure? The symbols don't match up with the letters in each person's name. I've seen codes like this before. You were close, but you didn't have all the information. Sabine used to be called Sabine. She'd been in Akros almost 2 years before Esmelle suggested she shorten her name to Sabine. She thought Sabine sounded a little too Fae. But the name Sabine would be more acceptable for a human with Fae ancestry, Malek murmured, taking another look at the symbols. Dax was right, they matched up perfectly if you knew the alternative form of Sabine's name. How many people knew she used to go by Sabine? Dax rubbed his chin, staring at the flickering light in the lamp, too many to reliably track. At the time she shortened her name, Bane hadn't yet split off on his own. When he left, a handful of my crew decided to follow him. All of them knew her original name, and Bane still calls her that on occasion. Bane mentioned he thought someone was targeting you, Malek said, recalling what Bane had told him about the Lich Ward on the Chalice. He said you've been causing problems for the city leaders. Yes, and it's likely they're responsible, Dax admitted. After what happened at the councilman's home, the iron dagger used during the ambush, and Terrence paying one of my men for information, it's obvious someone with deep pockets is behind this. If all 3 of us were being tracked, there are some common threads we can use to flesh out anyone else who may be involved. Malek nodded, suspecting Dax and Bane were going to be cleaning house very soon. What are the chances this is an attack on Sabine instead of you? Why is she hiding in Akros? Dax picked up the ledger. You may return to your ship. You're free to remain in the harbor until we've determined the ward on the Chalice has been fully removed. After that, we'll conduct the trade as originally agreed, and you can depart from the city. Malek straightened and narrowed his eyes on Dax. He folded his arms across his chest, deliberately using the motion to display Sabine's mark on his wrist. Sabine and I still have unfinished business. I won't leave until it's concluded. Dax clenched his jaw and didn't respond. Instead, the demon turned and headed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Malek frowned and shook his head. Time was running out very quickly. When she woke up next, he'd need to speak with Sabine privately and tell her the truth. He just hoped he didn't lose her in the process.